How's everybody doing tonight? Huh? Yeah, we'll have turkey. It's my one day where I eat meat. Because I'm vegetarian most of the time. No. Courtney's choosy vegetarian, as she'll eat chicken fingers and stuff like that. But is everybody traveling for Thanksgiving? Staying home? Staying home. I know Jody here's traveling. She's traveling ways. The great state of Maryland. Does anybody remember what religious affiliation Maryland was? Catholic. Very good. That history teacher right there should have chimed in immediately on that one, which he did. That was on the AP history exam. I remember that. That's like drilled into my brain. Well, why don't we get going? Because we actually have a lot to talk about tonight. Everybody cool with that? All right, let's say a little prayer, and then we'll get this party started, shall we? So, Lord, as we come here tonight, I hope that everybody is ready for a great discussion and the opportunity to really think through some of these harder issues that we're going to encounter about heaven, hell, and Jesus. It's going to be a fun night. Amen. All right. All right, so let's go through. We're going to go through our chapter recap. So chapters 1 and 2. We've said it each time here, the problem with the Bible, it's written over a period of 1,000 years by different authors with differing concepts of God, so it changes. You can choose your idea of God, but it changes throughout, so you can't nail down and say this is what everybody has believed from Genesis to Revelation. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. For the purposes of this book, we're assuming the Bible is a blend of history and mythology. So that's very important for this. All right, we move on to chapter 3. Which is God is not a being that exists apart from the universe. God is in and a part of everything. That's really critical, at least from the perspective of my book, because if you don't understand that point, then the rest of it doesn't work. And then God contains both good and evil. If God is everything, that means God is part of everything, good and bad. You do, as we say, God is you, right? So if God is you, you are good and bad. And what, of course, that means is that God has to contain both good and evil. Chapter 4, we came to this idea that God does not have a plan for our lives because God gives us free will. We choose to live a particular way, and in living that way, we are allowed to do whatever we want. But this is the most important thing, is that a lot of people say, well, God knows your steps. God knows what you're going to do. I sit there and I say, well, it's black box free will. God does not know what you're going to do because you have to make that decision for yourself. And that's a very different way of thinking about it, right? I mean, a lot of times we say God has a plan. God's choosing what you're doing. However, we can choose, and that's going to be very important for what we're talking about tonight. However, we can choose to access God's spirit of redemption, which, of course, is how we make changes to the world. That's inside of all of us. You have to choose to use that, but that is the way you can change the world. Chapter 5. So, basically, Augustine was wrong. Very important, right? Augustine was wrong. God does not expect us to live a perfect life. If God does not expect perfection from us, then God does not expect perfection from Jesus. And I remember I gave you that sheet where you could see the two sides, right? This is how things kind of end up going in two different directions. If you believe God is everything, then it changes the way you think about Jesus. It changes the way God thinks about you, right? Because what makes Jesus unique is his God consciousness. The idea that God is in everybody, but it's his ability to connect with the God inside of him that makes him unique, which is why we follow him. It's what he teaches. And of course, that changes everything because, of course, what it does, it makes the teachings accessible for us. We can do the things he's saying. Whereas if he's God and he's perfect, we can't do it. It's beyond our capability. So chapter 6, this is what we talked about last week. The notion that Jesus' death forgives our sins is rooted in the sacrificial laws of the Old Testament. Remember, we walked through all those laws, how you had to kill a goat without blemish, right, and all of that to make sure that everything was exactly, you'd shed blood, and that's what God needed. But we came to this idea of, does that really need to happen? Does that make sense that that actually has to happen? And so God can forgive us. This is what we came to. God can forgive us without Jesus' sacrifice because God can do anything. I pose the question, can God just forgive you? Well, of course, God can forgive you, right? Does God need Jesus? No. But why does Jesus matter? Jesus matters because it shows the depth of God's forgiveness, how deep that forgiveness goes. So I'm going to stop there for a second. Are we all on the same page basically with those ideas? Because today we're going to be cruising, my friends, cruising. So we're doing chapter 7 and 8. First, we're going to talk about heaven and hell, because this is a really, really critical concept to get across, and this is something that is greatly misunderstood by most Christians. So let's start. So heaven, what a lot of people think of when they think of heaven is they think of this place that's in the sky, right, or it's above us, something like that, right? What we don't realize, and what you have to kind of understand about Judaism at the time, was that Jewish tradition held that only a handful of people, when Jesus was alive, only a handful of people had ever gone to heaven. So there's 3, really. Enoch, he's in Genesis chapter 6, chapter 5, excuse me, Genesis chapter 5. Basically, it says Enoch walked with God, and God took him to heaven. That was it. So you got him. You got Moses, he was taken away. And then Elijah. So those are the 3 who you have who are actually in heaven. Everybody else goes to this place called Sheol. Now, I'll read you a verse from Job. Sheol's kind of smattered throughout. But Sheol, this is from Ecclesiastes. Whatever your hand finds to do, do with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. So Sheol is basically the equivalent of Hades in Greek mythology. So it's the idea, does anybody know does anybody know Hades in Greek mythology, kind of how it worked, what it was like? Does anybody know that off the top of their head? Yes, Susan. Okay, say it again.
And there's a boatman that takes you across into the underworld. Yeah, he rows you there, and that's where you stay.
Yeah. So it's actually really important to know. She's right. So it's the underworld. You get there. They put a coin in your mouth, and you give that coin to Charon. Charon takes you across the... Does anybody else need the Jesus points here? It's important to make sure you get those Jesus points for showing up. So Charon, you when you die, they put a coin in your mouth, and then when you see Charon, you give that coin to him, and he'll take you across the river Styx into the underworld. And in the underworld, you are what's called a shade or a shadow. So it's not quite a soul, it's a little different from that. But the idea is that you would go in, and sometimes, depending on how you died and the kind of life you lived, you could go to one of 2 places. Basically, you could go to a place where you were kind of living out and stuck, and you were just like stuck there forever. Or if you were good and righteous and you died the right way, you could go to a place called the Elysium Fields. And in the Elysium Fields, you would be there for about 1,000 years, and then you would drink from a river, and you would forget your previous life, and you would be resurrected into a new life, which is very interesting because if you read Revelation, that's pretty much the same idea. They're drawing on that concept from it. But Sheol is very interesting because basically you've had these 3 people who go to heaven. Heaven is off limits to humans. You can't really get there unless you're very, very special. But everybody else goes to Sheol, and you're a shade underneath the earth. That was their kind of concept of afterlife. Or you can even find ideas where they didn't even believe in afterlife, where it was just kind of like you die and that's it, you're gone. Well, remember, you have to put it in the time and place. In the time and place, basically, there were 3 people who were special, and that was it, because they were very special to God, and God took them up. Actually, in their bodies, too. This is the other thing. They didn't die. They were taken up by God at that point. So to be in heaven, it wasn't about your death. It was about being alive. I'm just trying to point this out to you so we're all on the same page with this. This is how they thought. Because today, if I were to ask you, tell me about heaven and hell, I want to know. What's the concept? Where's heaven? Tell me. I need to know. Where is it? Huh? Up? Where else? Tell me more about it. What do you know? It's beautiful? Absolutely. What are some of the things you heard? Like, it's the roads are paved with gold, right? Yeah, it's gold, and there's angels and clouds everywhere, right? Harps are big. Yeah, you got to have harps, right? That's important. There's singing, yes. And you get to see what? You get to see all of your relatives, the people who have gone before you, right? Okay, tell me a little bit about hell. What do you know about hell? Interested? Huh? Fire. Oh, absolutely. What else do we know about hell? Oh, it's great. It's crowded. Yeah. But there's no limit. No limit. So it's crowded. What else we got? Tell me more about hell. Huh? Pain. Who runs hell? Who's the devil or Satan? Lucifer. Yeah, we got all those names, right? Business is good, as we say, right? Business is going well. So all of these images come to us. So we have heaven, great place to go. Hell, not so much. How do you get to heaven? We talked about this last week with the formula. How do you get there? At least in the Christian faith. Believe in Jesus. Done. You believe in Jesus? Bam. Right there. Doesn't matter what you do in your life. You'll be forgiven. You're there. You get to those gold roads. It's fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, the actual history of heaven and hell, and what it is in the Bible. Because when you're reading it, you're thinking of those things, right? You're thinking of your soul detaches from your body and you go to this place or that. That is not what they are talking about in the New Testament. So I'm going to show you the difference. All right, let's jump ahead. All right. Do you see? So this is Jerusalem. Okay, you see that up there? And what you have to realize is that when you read the word hell in the New Testament, that word is Gehenna. And Gehenna is a Greek word for an area which you're seeing right there. You see that low-lying valley right there? That's Gehenna. Now, what's interesting about Gehenna is that the way Jerusalem worked was that they had this underground network of sewers. And they were constantly had water running through them. So it's not like today where they had pipes. They just had these underground networks and there's water constantly running through it. And everybody's house had like an access point to it. So you would dump all kinds of stuff in there. So if you finished your dinner and you had bones, you dump those in there. If you had other kinds of waste, obviously like, human waste you would get rid of. You would even dump bodies in there sometimes. And to give you an idea, sometimes if you had a miscarriage or your baby didn't survive, that's where you would place it into this. And so all of this came out. Where it came out was actually in this area, this valley called Gehenna. And so it would all come out. And what would happen is the people who were poor would actually live down in this area and they would scavenge. And so sometimes there would be things, and they would take animals, and they would use those animals to be able to eat. And there were also a lot of dogs and different things like that down there. And what they would do in this area, the dogs, they would fight with each other over the carcasses that would come down. And there was they would gnash their teeth at each other. And so the whole idea of weeping and gnashing of teeth comes from the animals that were actually down in there fighting for these carcasses. And what the people who lived down there would do is they would pile up all of these bodies and all of the waste, and they would set it on fire. And so if you were walking along the upper edge of it, right, like over there to the side, what would happen is you would look down and just imagine the scene, right? So you're on the upper part of this and you're walking around and you're looking down and you're seeing all of this smoke everywhere. There's literally fires, these fires going everywhere. There's smoke. People are walking around amidst it. You're seeing these dogs fighting for the little scraps that they get. I mean, that's a scene, right? You see that scene. And so what would happen is rabbis would take their disciples and they would walk with them around, and sometimes they would say, "Rabbi, what is it like to be separated from God?" And he would say, "It's like Gehenna." That's what it's like. He would use it as a visual to talk about that. Jesus was not the first person to do this. A lot of other rabbis talked about Gehenna as a hell-like place. So what's interesting about this, though, is that they would just use it as a symbol. And Jesus picks up on that and he says, yeah, so this is hell, right? So it's literally a physical place. Do you know where heaven is? Have any idea? Yeah, exactly. So heaven is right up there. That's heaven. Because you have to realize that for them, heaven and hell are not these existential places that are necessarily separate. Because what do you remember the whole kingdom of God thing? You're merging heaven and earth together into a single thing. That's what Jesus is saying. The kingdom of heaven is coming. They believe that these two worlds, heaven and earth, were going to be merged. And once they were merged, they're going to be literally here on earth. You don't get to go to heaven or hell in the sense of your soul separates. You're here. So if you were bad in your lifetime and you didn't do the right thing, you know where you were going to end up? In the valley. You were going to go to the Gehenna Valley. If you were good, though, you would be able to go to heaven, which is Jerusalem. You could be there in Jerusalem. And interestingly, the rabbis, they have discussions about this, and the rabbis would say, well, how long will a person in the new heaven, how long will they be in Gehenna? And they would say, oh, a person who goes to Gehenna, they will be there for 1 year. That's how long they have to stay in Gehenna to pay for their sins, and then they will be allowed back into heaven on earth. They would be allowed back in. So, you have to realize it's not an eternity that they're talking about, and it's very physical. Like what we're talking about here, when you're reading about heaven and all these things, you're thinking up in the sky, down underground, right? This is how they're thinking of it. It's very, very different from what we assume. But once you start reading the history of it and you realize that once the Messiah comes and heaven and earth are merged together, that's where you end up. So I want to stop there real quick. Do you have questions on this? Yes. Right. Well, and I'm not saying, and that's what most people believe today. I'm just saying that when you read the Bible, this is what they were talking about. Because they didn't believe in a soul. So we believe in a soul today, most people do. They didn't. And so that's really critical to understand this, because you're sitting there saying, well, why would they believe it like this? Well, that's what the resurrection is all about, because you're physically going to be walking around in Jerusalem, or you're physically going to be in Gehenna. Like, you have to realize that the resurrection, because they didn't believe in a soul, you had to have a physical place, and this is what they're thinking of at the time. If you read in Revelation, right, that you get to the end, what does it say? There's going to be a new Jerusalem that's literally going to come down and replace the old one that was destroyed, because it was after 70 that this was written. So it's this new Jerusalem, and that's what it's going to be. You're going to be walking around in there. Is this making sense what I'm saying? Even if you're like, it's weird, does it make sense? I know it's totally different from what you've known, but this is literally what they're talking about. Okay, let's jump forward. So, do you remember in this chapter, I talked about the prodigal son. Can we do a quick summary of the prodigal son so we're all on the same page with this? Okay, prodigal son, what happens? Basically, got two sons, and there's a dad, right? The younger son's like, hey, Dad, want your inheritance now so I can go spend it and have some fun, which, of course, is not a great thing to say, right? Because what does that mean? You're greedy, right? You don't care about, all I want is your money, Dad. Just give me your money. I'm going to go on with my life. So the dad does this. As I say in the book, this would have been, anybody hearing this would understand that a person of great means, and not only would this be insulting, it would be very hard to do because he'd have to sell off lands and assets to be able to give this to him. But it would also irrevocably change the nature of their relationship. This guy, he's cutting himself off from the family by doing this. So he leaves, he goes off, and what happens? He spends all of his money in dissolute living, right? What does he spend it on? He spends all his money on, he spends it on food, prostitutes, wine, right? Gambles it away, and then all of a sudden he wakes up one day and no more money. So then he gets a job at a pig farmer, which I love, right? Because they're Jewish, right? And now you're working with pigs. The pigs are eating better than he is. And so this is Jesus' way of saying he got his just desserts. And one day he comes to his senses, and I love the way they say that in the text. He comes to his senses, and he realizes, hold on a second. My dad's slaves eat better than I do. Why don't I go home? I'll apologize to my dad. I'll become one of my dad's slaves. And that's what I'll do. So he gets up and he starts going. And so as he's getting close to home, the father sees him far off, right? And he runs out to the son and he throws his arms around him. And he's so overjoyed to see him. The son's trying to tell the father, like, hey, I'm really sorry, Dad. But the father's not listening. And he calls over to some of his servants. He's like, bring my son his best robe. Kill the fatted calf, we're gonna have a celebration. For the son of mine was lost, and now he's been found. So the older son is super pissed about this, because what has he been doing? He's been working the whole time. He's been working outside, he's been doing everything the dad asks, and so he's like, he's not coming to the party. He's like, he just spent your entire inheritance. on like all this stuff, and I've done everything I've done for you all these years, and you're going to celebrate him? And he says, look, no, I mean, yes, you were here for me. You did everything I asked of you, and I appreciate that, and all I have is yours. But your brother was gone. He's home, and I celebrate his return. Now, here's the question I want to ask you. Do you agree that the story of the prodigal son is a reflection of how God is unconditionally loving and willing to forgive even the worst transgressions? Do you all think that's what this story is saying? Okay. It's interesting, because do you agree with it? I think this is the thing. Because so if you think that that's what that story is saying, then we get to the next question. Do you agree with it? So he went out and he spent his money on prostitutes and gambling and all that. How about somebody who murders somebody else? Does that fit? Yeah, go ahead.
In this story, the son he asks for forgiveness for what he did.
Yes, he does.
So the whole idea of forgiveness, I believe, needs to play into the rest of the scenario.
He tries to ask for forgiveness, and he has it in his mind that he's going to, but the father doesn't even really listen to that. He's like, yes, he has made it up in his mind that he's going to, but
The father doesn't need to hear it.
he doesn't need to hear it.
He knows it's in his heart.
Yes.
And I think that's where the same relationship between us and God comes in. He knows what's in our heart. He knows when we are truly sorry for what we did and are asking for forgiveness. So I see a strong parallel there.
Okay, now here's something interesting, Ken. That word unconditional, though, you just put a condition on it, which is the condition is you have to feel sorry for what you've just done. So here's my question. Do you all, and I think that most people would agree with your interpretation, Ken. That's why I pose this question. You're not wrong about that. That's why I ask, does this really speak to unconditional love? Because a condition is, right, a condition can be anything. You have to be sorry for what you did, right? Unconditional means it doesn't matter. There are no conditions surrounding that love. So I pose the question again. Do you think it's a reflection of how God is willing to unconditionally love you and forgive the worst transgressions? Okay, Jan, you want to say something?
I think the story of Sister Pregine is a good example for us. You know, she befriended this man who did such a horrible, horrible murder. But it wasn't about whether he was sorry he did it or wanted forgiveness. She just gave him that kind of picture of who God is. You are loved and you are treasured. And that's what made the difference for him.
For reference, that's Dead Man Walking with Sean Penn. And who was the other? Susan Sarandon, thank you. There we go. Yes. And that's a great example. I think the question is, though, do you believe, because and you've heard me make this statement many a time, this is why I believe in an unconditionally loving God. It's because of this story. But you could come back and do what Ken did. You could sit there and say, well, it's because the father knew that he was really repentant, that he was willing to take him back in. Exactly. So this is Jan, you're putting the pieces together. Now, in the version of God being perfect, right? You can make Ken's argument, right? In the version of God being God is everything, and we have choices to make, and God doesn't know those choices until we make them, you're 100% correct. And that's why I can interpret this as God is fully unconditionally loving. If you assume God is perfect, you can actually say, no, God is conditional. And in fact, that goes with a perfect God. That God's love is conditional. And this is a big difference between these two sides. This is why I really believe in the God is everything idea, is because I fundamentally believe that God is unconditionally loving. And that plays a role in what we're going to talk about later. Are we on the same page with that? All right. One other thing I just want to point out on this before we jump on to Jesus himself is that we are Presbyterian in here. The frozen chosen, as we are called. We make no expressions of faith, right? When I sit there and I talk to you all on Sunday, most, except for you guys up in the balcony, most people stare at me and don't react. Now, no, it's true. Some of you do, but a lot of times people just, it's nothing. I'm just like, I don't know. So, Calvin, this guy Calvin, John Calvin, who is the guy who came up with the theology that we follow, he came up with this thing called predestination. And he believed that we have no control over whether or not God will send us to heaven or hell. That basically, he believed before you're born, that's decided. You can be Mother Teresa, but if God decided before she was born that she's going to hell, she's going to hell. Nothing you can do about it. And this was his idea because he believed God had total and complete control over the world. And so it says they are predestined, right, for one place or the other before they arrive. Now, there's this guy, Karl Barth, who comes along, and this is I'm not going to get too much into him, but basically what he says is, he says that actually everybody goes to heaven. And he took Calvin's idea and he said, basically when Jesus died, he took the possibility that everybody could go to hell, that like, let's say, I was chosen for hell. Jesus took that and took that away from me. That was his idea. Now, what's the problem with universalism? That's what that's called. It's called universalism. What's the problem with it? That everybody goes to heaven. Do you like that idea, first of all? Do you like the fact that Vladimir Putin, who's causing so much harm right now, that he's just going to go straight to heaven once he dies? You good with that? Yeah. Okay. So Jan says she likes the idea that God loves Vladimir Putin as much as God loves any and all of us, but it doesn't change the fact that Vladimir Putin is making decisions that are hurting millions of people. So when he dies, now this of course is a jump. What we were talking about earlier is heaven is in Jerusalem and Gehenna. So now we're jumping to where we are today, which is that people just assume we have a soul and the soul goes to heaven or hell. So if we assume that is true, then what we're saying is that if God unconditionally loves all of us, so this is where the prodigal son leads you to. The prodigal son leads you to universalism. Is this idea. And I'm just showing you this because this guy came up with all the theology behind it. It doesn't really matter. The fact is that you can believe whatever you want. You don't need a theologian to tell you what it is. But basically, for our tradition does have a universalist bend behind it, which is this idea that we believe that if in Presbyterianism there is a belief, at least in our version of Presbyterianism, that everybody goes to heaven. But that has problems, doesn't it? I mean, it's like you get a free pass. You can be an awful human being, and you get a free pass. But this is what we talked about last week. Do you remember what we talked about? About is a sin ever a sin just by itself? Like the idea of, remember I told you the story about the woman who murdered her own son? And what did I tell you about that? I backed it up and I said, if you take that by itself, awful, right? But then I told you about her whole history. And what was her whole history? She was abused. She was sexually abused by her adoptive father again and again and again. Over a period of 8 years, she had all this trauma built up. And then one day she snaps. And then, of course, we don't know what happened to her dad, but she's probably repeating the same cycle. So the question becomes, when God's forgiving a sin, something that happens to us, it's more complex than just saying, you did this one thing. There's so much that's built into every decision we make, a whole lifetime sometimes of experiences that lead us to where we are. And that's why I can believe in unconditional love. Because if it was just about you making a bad decision, right, that would be harder for me. But knowing what causes us to make those decisions, knowing why I make certain decisions. Like I make decisions that sometimes I look at myself and I'm like, why did I do that? But I understand that when I can really examine it, it's because I have this whole history behind me of things that have happened to me that have influenced the way that I think and act. And that's true for all of us. Would you agree? So God has to unwind all of that. And that's why I believe in an unconditionally loving God. And that's ultimately why if there is a heaven and hell, And I don't know if there is. I can't speak to that. I've never been there. But if there is, I believe everybody goes to heaven. And I believe that God, even though there's all this pain in the world, that God can work that out. Even though we look at it and we say that's unfair. From our vantage point, it's unfair, but an unconditionally loving God can make that fair, I believe. Yes?
Before, but you said our Presbyterian tradition has a universalist bent, and one thing that does make us unique, like with the communion table, is we very explicitly say, this is God's table, God chose you, all are welcome, and anybody, whatever their background, can come accept what's considered like God's son's body broken for you.
Absolutely. And you're picking up on a point, which is that, it's when you start, how when I bless the elements up here, it's called fencing the table. And oftentimes when people fence the table, they say, only those who have been baptized may come up, or only those who have been confirmed, or only those who are X, Y, Z, or if you're not gay, or whatever it is that they come up with. They can come up with anything. They can say, you can be in the Catholic Church, got to be Catholic. They won't give it to you otherwise. I remember when I worked at Trenton Psychiatric, we would go around and we would give communion to all these people. The priest would skip over me when we were in there. And I'm like, these people aren't Catholic either, but you're giving it to them. I don't understand. But he would skip right over me. But that's called fencing the table. But yes, it is a reflection of that unconditional love that we believe that. Now, you might disagree and you might sit there and say there has to be judgment. There has to be some kind of recompense. And I get that. I get why you would, if you've been through hard things in your life, if you've dealt with really difficult things, yes, I get why you can believe that. But I also know this, that forgiveness unleashes a lot of that pain that you're dealing with. And I think a lot of times our desire for retribution comes from holding on to that pain. And I think that's what God does, is God helps us to release all of that we're holding on to, so that we can forgive and we can move on, because that's a much better way to live. Does anybody in here know what I'm talking about? I think you probably do, right? All right, so that's chapter 7. We all good with that? All right, so yeah, here we go. Perfect, right? No big deal. All right, we're going to move on to Jesus now. We're chapter 8. We're going to talk about his history and who he was as a person. And to understand who he was, the first thing you have to understand is the time and the place that he was born into. If you don't understand that, we're not talking about anything. And this is again a difference. If you talk to somebody who believes Jesus is perfect and was God all the way down, it doesn't matter when he was born. He's above all of that. On my side of the scale, because I believe God is everything, and because I don't believe that he is explicitly God where you all are not, right? I believe that he is God just like everybody else is God. What that means is that his time and place do matter. So I want to take a look at where he was born. All right, we got to look at the economics of Galilee, because that really matters for all of this. So Jesus is born around 4 BCE. We don't know for sure, but around the time of Jesus' birth, there's the destruction of a city called Sepphoris. This is really, 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 really important for you to understand this, because if you're missing Sepphoris, you're missing out on a lot of what forms who he is. Jump forward one. Okay, so in the book, this is actually from the book, this map, you can see that Nazareth is up there in the hill country, right? And down below is Sepphoris. Sepphoris was a city for the wealthy. It was a city that when they unearthed it, they found this home with this beautiful mosaic on the inside of it. And these were wealthy Jewish people who lived in Sepphoris. Nazareth was like the sticks. It's like you're going up into nowhere. These are people who you probably, like I use no offense, but West Virginia is kind of the closest thing that we can think of in the United States to that, which is just people who are up in the mountains, isolated from everybody else, is kind of the way it was. And at the time that Jesus was growing up in Nazareth, there's probably about 100 people, 100 families that lived there. Let's give or take. And it was just this poor village in the middle of nowhere. Jesus was likely born in Nazareth. On Christmas Eve, where do we say he was born? Bethlehem. But he was born in Nazareth because he's called Jesus of Nazareth. He's not called Jesus of Bethlehem. He's called Jesus of Nazareth. So we know that that's where he's from. the gospel writers put him in Bethlehem because they want him to be part of a prophecy and all of these different things. But this is where he's born. So he's born in 4 BCE. Now, at the same time that he's born, around the same time, Sepphoris is destroyed. Decimated. So what happens is, this group of people, go back one, keep going, stay there. This group of people, led by this guy named Judas the Galilean, he gets 2,000 people of his followers, and they go into Sepphoris, they raid the royal armory in there, and they basically tear the whole city apart, and they take it hostage. They take hostage all of the Jewish, all these wealthy Jews. And what do you think Rome does? They're super happy about this? No. They send in the Roman army, and they just wipe these guys out. They kill Judas, and by killing him, they also take all of the 2,000 followers, and they literally crucify all of them. 2,000 people en masse. It's a horrific thing. And then they burn the city to the ground because they're so mad at the citizens of Sepphoris for not better protecting their arsenal. And then they sell off the women and children to slaves. So that's what happens to this in 4. Now just imagine, Nazareth is 5 miles away from Sepphoris. The people of Nazareth, Jesus is a little baby at this point, they could see that city burning from Nazareth. They could see what happened. They knew what happened. So this place gets burned to the ground. About 10 years later, now you can go forward. 10 years later, they get the okay to rebuild Sepphoris. They're going to rebuild it from the ground up. It was burned to the ground, wiped out initially. They're going to rebuild it. Jesus is how old at this point, give or take? 10, 11, somewhere in there, right? Maybe 12. So what ends up happening is they need tons of labor to rebuild this city. And Jesus is called a tekton in the Bible. Do you know what tekton is? We call it what do we know it? We call it a carpenter, but really it's a day laborer. But truthfully, he was more than likely a stonemason. He worked to help build these palatial homes. And so just imagine, he's this poor kid from Nazareth. He's 12 years old, and he goes with his brothers down into work every day. 5 miles, he'll walk one way to get into Sepphoris. He starts work in the morning. He works all day on these massive homes. He's building them all up, right? And actually, business is good. You have to realize everything is going really well at this point, because when he's working and his brothers are working, they're all making money. That means they're eating better, right? They have a good life. They're actually doing very well. I mean, they're still very poor, but they're doing okay. All right, things are going great. They're building Sepphoris. They're making all these houses. They're rebuilding it up. Then we come to the next part. So Emperor Augustus, who was the one who kind of founded the Roman Empire, he dies. And then Tiberius, well, he doesn't die. He's killed. His wife kills him because she wants her son to take over. So Tiberius, he takes over, and Tiberius was crazy. And because he was crazy, he starts hoarding all of the money into the Roman treasury. So he takes all of the coinage and he starts, because he wants to spend it on himself. Now what happens, you all probably know this, what happens when you start taking money out of the economy? What happens to the price of goods? They spike. What happens to credit and loans? All of that goes up too. So now remember, it's not like today. Today in the world, everything rebounds super fast, right? You know, the Fed makes a decision, we feel it 3 months later. It takes years for this to happen, right? So this happens in 14. By 20, all of a sudden, the economic collapse starts to happen in Galilee and other parts of the Roman Empire. So basically, it's starting to collapse in on itself. Now, I want you to think about this. So 20 is where everything starts to fall apart. Remember, Jesus, he's working. He starts working probably around 6, 7 CE. By the time he gets to 20, he's been working for a solid, think about how many years he's been working at this point. 14 years, somewhere in there. And then everybody's doing well, and then what happens? Bam. There's no more work. The work dries up. You were eating, everybody was happy, and you didn't see it coming, and now it's all gone. And everybody starts looking for work, right? So just imagine, things are going along, you're doing okay, we can make it, but there's no work to be had. 8 years later, Jesus begins his ministry. Now, between 20 and 28, what happens? Things get really bad economically. like really, really bad. So go to the next slide for me. So the Sea of Galilee, you see that up there? So you got Capernaum, Gennesaret, Magdala, Tiberias. Why is it Tiberias? Tiberias is renamed for him. That was not originally the city, but it's named after him. Capernaum is way up there to the north. Why should you know Capernaum? Who's from Capernaum? His first disciple, what was his name? Peter. Peter is from Capernaum. Why? Now, I want you to think about this. This is so critically important. If you were a fisherman, and fishermen had like middle-class incomes, basically. If you were a fisherman, you're making a middle-class income. Why would you leave that behind? A family business that you've been probably for generations. Why would you leave that behind to follow Jesus? Taxation, and you're not making any money. You've got no money. Like, you don't follow somebody like Jesus if times are good. You follow somebody like Jesus when you've got no options at your disposal. So these guys who are running, like all of these little, like you have these little fishing villages and then you got the city. And I've talked about this before. Do you remember that, who owns the Sea of Galilee? Who owns it? Rome, Herod, but Herod really owns it. It's his. It's a family lake. And if you're going to fish on that lake, do you know what you have to do? You have to get a leasing agreement from him, and they tell you how many fish you're allowed to catch. So at first, right, they'll say, okay, for every 10 fish you catch, like back when times are good, you got to give us 4. So not bad, right? What they think happened was by the time you get to about 28, for every 10 fish you catch, you have to give them 9. So at that point, what's the point of even fishing if you're taking 1 to market? You're not getting anything, right? Because they were trying to feed all the people in the city and keep the prices low for them, but the fishermen weren't making anything. And it was a bad situation. This is why many of Jesus's followers are fishermen. These people who are literally out of work. Does this make sense what I'm saying? Okay, so the situation economically is really bad. All right, jump forward for me. All right, so let's just take a look at a quick timeline of Jesus' life. So Jesus was born in the town of Nazareth. We're going to say between 7 and 4. This is in the book, right? So we basically say it's between 7 and 4 BC. We don't know. He could have been born later than that. He could have been born earlier. It's really hard for us to know when he was born. Then we know that we fast forward, and I've just given you all that part in between, right? But basically we know that Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. I say it in the book, and I think it's probably true, although it can't be proven at this point, but it is likely that Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist originally. That he was part of John's movement. John was out there baptizing, talking about the coming of the kingdom. And so he was probably part of that movement, and then once John gets arrested by Herod, he ventures off on his own and he starts his own movement. You with me on that? So he gets baptized by John, and what do we know about him being baptized by John? Like, he gets baptized, what happens? Do you remember in Mark what occurs? He comes up and he sees what? It says it in each of the Gospels. That he sees the dove, which is the Holy Spirit, right? And there's this moment where it's like he goes through this shift. In Mark, he goes through this main shift where we see when we get, remember in chapter 6, he goes home to Nazareth. Everybody's like, who's this guy? I don't know this guy. I don't know who this person is. I don't remember he was like this before. So what Mark shows us is that it seems like something happens at his baptism. We don't know what, but there seems to be a shift that occurs at that point. Now in Luke and Matthew, what happens? Well, he's born that way, so it's, there's no like change. But it's a different way of thinking about it. But we know that he's baptized somewhere in there. So then, after he goes off on his own, he starts preaching about the coming of God's kingdom and healing the sick. So he begins his ministry. He goes off, he's going all throughout Galilee, and he's basically preaching about these things. He's healing people, he's performing miracles. And the reason, by the way, I say this in the book, but I think it's really important to say, that when he heals people, does he charge anything? No. This is what made him unique. So there were tons of healers. He was not the only healer at that time. The only thing that made him different was that he did not charge for his healings. What made him unique was he said, all you have to do if you want to be healed is you got to listen to what I say. Got to listen to my teachings. And people were down for that. It's why he got all these crowds, because he wasn't charging anybody any money for what he was doing. healers normally charged and made a lot of money off it. It's very profitable. All right. So then all of a sudden something happens, right? He's going through, and then Jesus, we see this, we celebrate on what's the day? What's the day that this happens? Palm Sunday. So Palm Sunday, somewhere between 30 and 33, we don't know where. So his ministry could have been short as a year to 3 years. We don't know how long it is. It could be, we honestly don't. So Jesus disrupts the business transactions in the temple that are taking place. This is the act that leads to his arrest. Now this is where, if you are a traditionalist and you've read the Bible, you would say, Alex, that's not the way it happened. How does it happen in the Bible? What happens? He goes in on Palm Sunday. Just think about the Holy Week. What happens? He goes in on Palm Sunday, flips the tables, and what does he do after he flips the tables? He walks right on out. Nobody stops him. Nobody says anything to him. He teaches for the rest of the week. And then what happens? Then there's on Monday, Thursday, we have the dinner, right? And then he's turned over, Good Friday, all of that. I sit back and I say, that makes no sense. And do you know why that makes no sense? Do you know how many, this is during Passover. Do you know how many people would be there during Passover? Do you know the money that would be changing hands in the temple courtyard? Go to the temple. So look, what would happen is, we talked about this last week, but you would go in to the temple, right, into the courtyard, and you would purchase, like this was big money, because in order to get that goat, remember the goat has to be without blemish. So the goat, you have to buy it from them. It's super expensive. And by the way, you didn't have the right money, so you had to change your money, and then you could go buy the goat, and then, after you buy the goat, then you could go in and you could sacrifice it. Now, on Passover, this is when everybody's doing it, so all this money's going on. Do you think a dude could come in to that courtyard, start slinging stuff everywhere, and just walk right on out, and everybody be like, well, that's just Jesus. You know how he is. You know how he gets worked up. No. There would be, at that time, they had more guards stationed there, just like you do at a bank when you're having big transfers. You have more guards. He would have been arrested immediately. Sight on scene. Likely, he would have been taken to be crucified that moment. Like, there's a whole thing, you know how he goes and he goes to the trial, and they're like, they put him on trial, they do that. No, for something like that, in the middle of Passover, they would just be like, hey, Pilate, will you sign his death warrant? Yeah, no problem. They would have been and Pilate was known, they actually sent, we know this is true. They sent complaints up to the legate of Syria, saying, this guy's putting people to death without putting them on trial. Pilate did that all the time. He did not care. So, but in the Gospels, what happens? He sits there and he's like, we got to let this guy go. He's a good guy. Why would we? This guy did not care about the Jews. In fact, he hated the fact that he'd been stationed in Jerusalem. He hated that area, and he wanted to make them feel the pain as much as he could. So anybody who did anything wrong, he was just like, crucify him. I don't care. Let's just get rid of him. So, like, when you're thinking about this situation, just think about, he goes in, he does this. This is what leads him to ultimately be crucified. Now, I don't know if you agree with me or not. What do you think about my hypothesis? Do you think that I'm wrong? And the truth is, who knows? I mean, what do you guys think? I'm throwing out an idea. I'm interested to know your reaction to that. Makes sense to you, Rich? You're on Team Alex. That's good to know. Does anybody else want to go with it? Yeah, go ahead, Susan, and then we can go to Rich.
If we only have Pilate involved, then we don't have the high priests, and then we don't have that conflict with the religious establishment.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. So she's bringing up a point. Do you remember how he goes and he's in front of the Sanhedrin, and he basically is tried before them, and they're like, we can't put anybody to death, so we have to ask Pilate to do it, and that's why Pilate's like, I don't really want to do this. He seems like he's a good guy, right? Like, yes, you're taking rid of all of that. Because here's the thing. This is the question. And once you answer this question, it opens up a whole new way of seeing Jesus. Why did he go in to do this? Why did he go in to turn over the tables? Like, this is the key to understanding Jesus and his movement. Once you understand this, you got the whole thing figured out. Why did he do it? Huh? To get arrested for sure, but why that focal point? Why does that, there's other ways he could get arrested. Why does he choose this place of all places? Yes, Ken. Yes.
You had to take the Roman currency in there and buy the Jewish currency. There's money they make off of that. They make money off the animals. He goes in and disrupts the entire economic system.
And who ultimately oversees it?
Rome does, because the money funnels up the chain to Rome.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's the issue, right? It's not Jewish run, really. Anybody who's a priest who works in here is loyal to Rome. The Jews are not running their own religion. And this, of course, is the centerpiece of it all, is the temple. It's a beautiful temple, but it's run by Rome. Any priest has to basically, you got to get the check mark from Rome to make sure that you're going to be there. So you're a Rome-approved priest to be in there in the first place. This is the problem. This is why he says, you've made it a den of robbers. Because he looks at this and he says, we aren't even running our own show here, people. Rome is in everything, and we got to get it out. We got to get it out. And this brings us back to, what is the Messiah supposed to do? What's the purpose of the Messiah? What's his job? And in Christianity, it's to save the world, right? But what is in Judaism, what's the Messiah's job? Do you remember? He is a king. A Messiah is a king, and he's supposed to raise an army, and he's supposed to make them an independent nation again. Now, here's the question. How does Jesus go about doing that? He's from Galilee. He doesn't have a lot of soldiers with him, does he? So why does he go in? This is the thing. When I started putting this together, I was like, oh, this makes way more sense. So he goes in, causes this, jump forward one, and then he's convicted of treason by the Roman government, and he's executed by means of crucifixion. Now, remember, he's convicted of treason. What is treason? Trying to overthrow the state. That's what treason is. Absolutely. So he goes in, he does this. It's weird. You would think, oh, no, he wouldn't be convicted of that. No, as the Messiah, they basically sit there and they say, why are you doing this? And he says, because I'm a Messiah. I'm a king. Well, that automatically puts you at odds with the king who already exists, Tiberius. So they're just going to say, treason, done, and then they throw you up on the cross. Now, here's where things get problematic, right? He's going towards it. If you assume that he knows what he's doing, he's going to get up on that cross. He wants to get up on that cross for a reason. But then what's the last thing he says? The last thing he says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, what does that mean, to be forsaken? What does that word mean? I've heard that my whole life, and I finally looked it up when I was like in my 20s. I'm like, what does that even mean? Given up, abandoned, absolutely. So how is it, again, if you're going down the perfect side of things, and he's God, how can he say that he's been abandoned by God in his last moment? This has been the thing that's flummoxed theologians. They've been like, well, I don't know. I don't know why he said it like that. Why would he? And so they have come up with all these reasons. Or you could just look at the reason that's staring you right in the face, which is that this guy, he thought he was on a mission from God, and he felt abandoned by God in his very last moment. Now, why would he feel abandoned by God? You answer this, here you go. You got the answer to everything. Why would he feel abandoned? What did he think was going to happen? I showed you in the previous thing, what was heaven and earth going to be? Remember? Heaven and earth get merged together, right? And so heaven is in Jerusalem. That's the center of it. You got hell and Gehenna. You with me still? Right? You got the whole thing. It's right here. So if that's going to happen, though, what's got to happen? Who's going to do all that? Who's going to make that happen? It's got to be God, right? God has to do it. God has to create that. God has to merge heaven and earth. So if he's truly the Messiah, if he's truly God's Messiah and he's going to make that happen, there's this idea, and this is where you get into, you remember when Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, he's being tempted by Satan and he's up at the top of the temple? And Satan says to him, throw yourself from the temple, for God will not allow his Messiah to dash his foot against a stone. This was a thought at the time, which is that ultimately, if you truly are the Messiah, God will not allow you to die. So he gets up there, and I think he truly believes that by getting up on the cross, he's going to force God's hand, and God's going to come, and all the angels and all these things are going to come and cause the merging of heaven and earth right at this point in time. That's going to create it, and it's all going to happen the way that they're anticipating, right? But he just has to get to the point to force God's hand. And he gets up there, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and it never happens. And then he cries out at his last, God, why did you abandon me? And he dies. Now, that's a very different take than what we know of traditionally, right? But if you put the pieces together, that's where it leads. Until we get to something that nobody expects, the resurrection. And that's where it changes everything. And I don't even know if Jesus was expecting that. But let's go. We're not talking about the resurrection tonight. This is where we're ending on his life. I want to hear your thoughts on this, because I know that's a little depressing to put it that way. But, like all the things that I've laid out. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it makes sense? Does it work? Or do you disagree? Do you sit there and say, no, I don't know if that's what he was trying to do? And you're not going to be wrong if you disagree, by the way. None of us know. This is my theory based on the pieces I've put together. But your theory could be just as well be right. So I'm interested to know, what do you think? We got a few minutes to talk, barely, but we have a few. Yes, Frank, I was hoping you'd say something.
Two questions.
Yes.
One is, if Jesus was God conscious, why would he make this mistake in his belief?
Yeah.
Number two, there are at least 4 occasions in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus supposedly tells his disciples that he thought that the chief priest would crucify him and that he would be resurrected on the 3rd day.
Yes.
Why would that be? And that contradicts what you're saying, unless the gospel writers had their own point of view. They were biased.
All right. Very good points. Thank you, Frank. Frank is good. He's read my book very, very closely, and he's come up with contradictions to the things I've said. So I'll answer your second question first, which is, why would they have these basically prophetic moments where Jesus says, I'm going to die and rise on the 3rd day? I would very much argue, I can't prove it, but I would argue that those are insertions later that they put in the narrative. Remember, the first gospel is written 40 years after Jesus' death, and they're trying to piece it all together in that way. And again, I can't prove that. Maybe he did say that. And you could be very, very well be right. If that is an actual original saying, then my whole theory would be wrong. But we can't know one way or the other. But to the other point, and your first question was, one more time? Oh, God consciousness. Yes, why would he make that mistake? Okay, this is very important. God consciousness. Does that mean that you can see into the future if you're God conscious, like you're God conscious? No. You know what you know. You're connected to God, right? And he's also, this is again, if he's God, he's above all of the environmental influences. All the stuff we looked at with heaven and all of that, he's a man like everybody else. He's influenced by his place and time. And this is what they all thought at that time. So what I would argue is that he was God. He has this God consciousness, for sure, because we see it in his teachings. Like, his teachings are so unique and so brilliant that I cannot believe that this guy did not have a very, very direct connection to God in the way that he was like his God consciousness was. However, that doesn't mean that he's above being influenced by his environment and believing that if he does these things, he can cause these actions. And I think this is one place where we could sit there and we could say, does Jesus really believe that God is everything? Now, this is where you could come back and you could get on me, right? Because you could say, based on his way of thinking, God is an entity, these things. And I've been arguing this whole time, right, that Jesus would have thought that God is everything. But here he's thinking of God really as a being, right, that's going to come in and cause all of these actions. And that is a contradiction in my argumentation, which is that I would say that on the one hand, yes, he thought of God as everything. On the other hand, though, there are points where you can see it in the Gospels very clearly where he thinks of God as an entity, as a being. Yes, Don? So I think that to the end, I guess it's really your question of what do you think the Messiah is? In his day and time, was he the Messiah? Well, based on the Jewish definition, no, he was not. We as Christians have redefined what the Messiah is, and we say the Messiah was doing X, Y, Z, so we fit it into our definition of it. But I would say this is probably more to the point. I think he very much believed he was the Messiah. I absolutely believe that to be true. I have no doubt that he thought that. No doubt. And I hope I answered your question, Frank, but you got me on that one. That was a good one.
An atheist might say that proves it. There is no God.
Absolutely. You could point to this. Yeah, absolutely. So he said an atheist might sit there and say, well, look at that. He feels abandoned by God. There is no God. Absolutely. You could make that argument if you wanted to. He clearly believes in a God, but at the last moment when he thought God was going to do something for him, God didn't. So these are I'm glad that you're pointing out these flaws, because my thesis is not crystal all the way through, and you run into these problems because Jesus himself does not have a consistent understanding of God, and that may be because he's being written about 40, 60, 80 years after he dies, and we don't actually know exactly what he thought or believed. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we're kind of interpolating some of this, and who knows whether we're right or wrong. This is my way of making sense of it. You may disagree with it, and that's okay, but it's just my way of making sense of it. Are we? Yes, go ahead.
This makes logical. I think the emotional part of me is like, but then there's no betrayal, there's no Judas.
Yes.
The narrative is completely.
Yes. Well, and in the book, I talk about where did the Judas betrayal. Do you remember? So Judas in Greek is, do you know what the Hebrew translation of Judas is? To Hebrew is Judah. And Judah is in the story of Joseph. In the story of Joseph, what does Judas do? Judah sells out his brother for 20 pieces of silver. And what does Judas do? Sells out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver or 40 pieces, however many it is. So it's there. That story has been superimposed. So you're right. The betrayals, all of those things. And they're amazing stories, aren't they? But likely untrue about how he died. Basically, what you see in the text, and this is really important, is that Jesus knew he was going to die, and he was headed for it. And my guess would be, because think about the Last Supper. This is another thing in the book that I talk about. The Last Supper, what we talk about is stuff that we think Jesus actually said. And he says, tomorrow you will be in God's kingdom. Like literally, he says, tomorrow it's going to be here. So think about that. He thought that when he got up on the cross, it's going to happen tomorrow. So don't worry, guys. Like we're literally going to be drinking wine and eating in God's kingdom. That's part of that tradition. So he knew what was going to happen. And my guess would be that his disciples knew also. He was not keeping that from him. They knew what he was going to do. And they were like, okay, man, you do it and let's make it happen. Like, I think they were very well aware. In the Gospels, it makes them seem like they don't have any idea what he's talking about. But I think that they very well knew. Again, my theory could be wrong. I preached about this my second year here, and people didn't take it well, as you might imagine. So anyways, it's been great having you guys tonight. We're off for the next week because we have Thanksgiving. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. We're back on the 30th. We're going to do chapter 9, Resurrection. Chapter 10 is the last one, and then we're going to bring it all together at the end. Does that sound good? All right. Have a great evening. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it.